Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's Bookstore, and I am very pleased to welcome back to Gibson's Bookstore virtually Cy Montgomery, who is a friend of the store. Cy, you were actually one of our first virtual events last year, and I'm so pleased to welcome you back now that we've polished how we do things a little bit. Congratulations to you. Yesterday was the publication day of your new book, The Hummingbirds Gift, Wonder, Beauty, and Renewal on Wings. Congratulations to you.
Oh, thank you. I can't think of a better way to celebrate it than with you all.
To our audience members at home, Cy did come visit us at the store, and she has signed copies of the Hummingbirds Gift, which are available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are open for in-store browsing. We take orders online. You can do curbside pickup, or we are happy to ship to you. Cy, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We will be taking some questions towards the end of the event. So if you have any, please do type them into the chat sidebar or the Q&A function. I will be keeping an eye on that, and we will be asking those towards the end of the event. But Cy, thank you for joining us. You have a presentation for us.
Indeed. All righty, here we go.
All right. We're covering our camera because we get concentration face. And there it is. It's showing beautiful.
Great. Well, you know what? I thought I'd begin at the beginning, if you'd let me read just a little bit from the very first pages of this book. And it'll kind of explain what I'm trying to do here. So here we go from the introduction. This is the story of a resurrection. It's not the world-altering tale of Jesus's rise from the dead after crucifixion. You already know that one. Nor has this story the dramatic sweep of the saga of Persephone, daughter of the Greek goddess Demeter, whose yearly escape from the underworld brings us the seasons for planting and harvest, spring, summer, and fall. Or the Egyptian myth of Oryssus, the murdered king brought back to life by the love of his sister. But it's the story of a miracle, nonetheless. Granted, it's a small miracle. How small? Not much bigger than 2 bumblebees, for that was the size of Zuni and Maya, 2 infant orphaned hummingbirds, so young we couldn't even tell their species when I first met them more than 10 years ago. When these 2 baby birds, who turned out to belong to the species known as Allen's hummingbird, arrived at rehabilitator Brenda Sherburne LaBelle's Fairfax, California home, they were at death's door. Nobody knows what happened to their mother. For mere humans to restore them to the wild required an epic effort. And it was my great good fortune that Brenda invited me to help. Over the course of the weeks I spent helping Brenda, I learned just how demanding and fraught was our task. We were tending to tiny creatures as delicate as froth. In fact, they're bubbles, because hummingbirds are made of air. Their tiny bodies are crammed with no fewer than 9 air sacs, in addition to their 2 huge lungs and enormous heart. And yet, in order for them to survive, we had to repeatedly insert into their tiny bubble-filled bodies a giant pointy syringe that looked, compared to them, like the top of the Empire State Building. If we didn't, they would starve. If we overdid it, they could pop. As it was, I was fearful at first that my touch alone would break them. Everything about a hummingbird is diaphanous. Their delicate bones are exceptionally porous. Their legs are thinner than toothpicks. Their feet as filmy as embroidery thread. Scientists began attaching metal bands to the legs of birds to track and identify them as far back as 1890. But the first bands deemed light and safe enough for hummingbirds' fragile legs were not developed until 1960. And they, of course, were only deployed on adult birds. Our infants were far more fragile yet. Baby hummingbirds require constant diligent, round-the-clock attention. They tax even their mothers, who may make more than 100 flights a day to find food for their babies. Even with Brenda's decade of experience, we knew we were no match for a mother hummingbird. We would have to work even harder and longer to make up for that. Saving those tiny babies was a big task. But the rewards, as I was to learn, were even bigger. Well, one reason the rewards were so big is that hummingbirds are just pure magic. Writers far more talented than I have described them in words like this: a glittering fragment of the rainbow. This is a photo, as most of the photos you're seeing were by Tia Strombeck. And this particular hummingbird is a green-crowned wood nymph that she photographed in Ecuador. They've been described as a magic carbuncle of flaming fire. They've been called breathing gems. The throat alone on an Anna's hummingbird has been described as like roses steeped in liquid fire. But these little birds are not just beautiful. Their astonishing powers are unrivaled. They're almost miraculous. Alone among all birds, the hummingbird can hover, really hover. Now, there's other birds that appear to hover, but really they're not hovering. The wind is keeping them there. These guys really can hover. They can hover for an hour. They can also fly backwards. They can even fly upside down. And a hovering hummingbird's wings beat so fast, they look like this. And the beats couldn't even be counted until the invention of the stroboscope, or strobe light, that would freeze the action. The hovering wings beat more than 60 times a second. And especially for such small birds, their speed is astonishing. A male Allen's hummingbird can dive to impress a female in its courtship display from the sky at 61 miles an hour. They can plunge from 50 feet at more than 60 feet per second. And per body length, the Allens beats even the peregrine falcon's dive, because it even beats the space shuttle. If you're looking at body length, the space shuttle screams down through 207 body lengths per second, but the Allens is at 385. And some hummingbirds, like this ruby throat, can fly vast distances. The longest distance migrating bird in the world, again in terms of body lengths, is another hummingbird, a rufous hummingbird with its emerald crown. And it flies from Mexico to nest in Alaska. And a little ruby throat like this one flies 500 miles from the east coast of the US across the Gulf of Mexico. So how do these little miracles do this? Well, a quarter of the body is given over to flying muscles. A flying hummingbird breathes 250 times a minute. Its heart beats 500 times a minute, 15 times as fast as an ostrich. And to fuel this fast life, a hummingbird may have to eat its weight in nectar every time it visits a feeder. Now, many people know that they drink from flowers, but a lot of people don't realize that in addition to visiting something like 1,500 flowers a day, they also will eat between 600 and 700 insects, which are essential for them. Now, the nectar alone, if it were converted to its human equivalent, someone told me that would be drinking 15 gallons of soda or whatever a day. So here we have this impossible, fragile creature who lives large with huge appetite, Herculean feats, and almost miraculous powers. Well, thanks to Brenda, I got a hand in saving 2 of them who otherwise would have died. But it seemed like an impossible feat. These guys are so tiny, and nothing could be more vulnerable. They hatch the size of bumblebees from eggs as small as navy beans. Their nest is the diameter of a quarter. Hummingbirds are the lightest birds in the sky. There's 240 species at least, all of them in the Western Hemisphere. And the largest is only 8 inches long. The smallest is this little critter. This is known as the bee hummingbird. It lives in Cuba. It's just weighs a single gram. Its whole body weighs less than a single feather of some other species of birds. So imagine how difficult it is to care for babies this tiny and delicate. To even look at them, Brenda used a magnifying glass. They were that hard to see. Touching them scared us to death. Even touching them with your finger can damage their tiny feathers. And most medical treatments would just kill them. If a hummingbird breaks a bone, for example, you can't splint it because the splint weighs too much. If they need a drug, the slightest overdose will kill them. And the dangers facing these little birds, they're just almost overwhelming. I mean, in the wild, without humans messing anything up, everyone eats them. Hawks and runners and jays and squirrels and possums and raccoons, even dragonflies will eat them. Even praying mantids will eat them. Bass will jump out of the water and swallow them whole. And fire ants and yellow jackets will sting the babies to death in the nest. And the adults, they can get killed on the stamens of thistles. In the wild, they can die from infestation of mites. They fly into spider webs and get stuck and die there. But then you add people. Now, they die when they hit our windows. They die because of our pesticides. They frequently die because of our pet cats. Sometimes they kill each other. Typically, you'll see a Hummer driving a rival away from a food source. Well, they'll do that until the rival starves. So just imagine what it takes to save one of these infinitesimally tiny infant birds when it's orphaned. Well, one thing that it takes is 200 fruit flies, caught fresh and crushed with a mortar and pestle and mixed with a special cocktail of nectar and vitamins and enzymes and oils, and you have to get it exactly right. And this mixture must be delivered into the baby's gaping mouths by syringe every 20 minutes from dawn to dusk. And doing this, I have to tell you, was just terrifying. To stick a syringe deep inside the beak of a baby bird, oh my God. And ours was fitted with a slender catheter instead of a needle. But remember, look at the bills on some of these hummingbirds. And this is another one of Tia's Ecuadorian species, but they look like a sword swallow when their mother comes and sticks the bill down there. It scared me to death to feed them, but I learned how to do it. And as I mentioned earlier, if you don't feed them enough, they'll starve. But more horrifying yet, imagine if you fed them too much and you popped a baby hummingbird. Well, veterinarians will tell you that birds of any kind are their most difficult patients. Mammals are really easy to treat compared to them. That's because mammals and birds are made of different stuff. Because we mammals, we're mostly made out of heavy fluids. And even the early Greeks knew that. And they believed that our health was based on the balance of fluids, which they called humors. But birds, and hummingbirds more than any other, are not made of fluid. They are made of air. And caring for infant hummingbirds drives home that shocking central fact about the bodies of birds. Now, why are they all made of air? Well, because these tiny little guys, they need to fly. You can't afford to have heavy bones. Everything about them is airy. The skull even is scaffolded with passageways for air. Birds, their ancestors, the dinosaurs, had teeth. Birds lost their teeth. They didn't want to carry that extra weight. And their feathers, like strips of Velcro, are really made of air. They're interlocking barbules made for catching air. And even so, a typical bird's feathers outweigh its skeleton. And all birds, their bodies are just full of air sacs. In a hummingbird, there's 9 of them. I mentioned that earlier, packed in that tiny body. 1 pair in the chest, another under each wing, 1 under each shoulder, a pair in the abdomen, and 1 in the neck. And this makes them so fragile. An injection can puncture an air sac, and so can almost anything else. There was one poor hummingbird I heard about that came into a rehab center after it had gotten stuck in sticky polyurethane. And the rehab center tried to remove the goo with canola oil, but then the bird was oiled like some poor penguin after the Exxon Valdez. So a vet tried to wash off the oil, but the water from the faucet popped one of the air sacs, which is like popping your lung. So another rehabber tried to wash off the oil by gently squirting water from a syringe, and even this ruptured an air sac. They really are little more than air, wrapped in shimmering light. Now, the reason for a hummingbird's iridescence, by the way, is also air. So, except for the flight feathers on the wings, a hummingbird's feathers have these little structures on them. They're called platelets, but they're different from the clotting factor in our blood. And they are filled with microscopic air bubbles. And the shape and the thickness of each platelet and the amount of air inside determines the color that you see. And the air bubbles diffract light into colors that reflect back in a flash of iridescence. So it's all this air and all this delicacy. This is what gives these birds the unrivaled power of flight. So maybe I think this is why baby hummingbirds inspire such tenderness. I found that there was nothing I wouldn't do for the 2 that I was privileged to work with Brenda. The twins that I helped her raise, as I mentioned, were Alan's hummingbirds. And when we met them, well, she met them a few days earlier. They were, when I got there a few days later, they were maybe 10 and 12 days old. Usually one hatches first and the other a couple of days later. But we didn't even know they were Alan's then. They were just covered with little pin feathers like the quills on tiny porcupines. They didn't show their colors. Their beaks were short and stubby. They didn't much look like anything. And yet, we totally submitted to their tyranny. Every morning, one of us would grind the morning coffee beans and the other would be crushing the fruit flies. And every 20 minutes, we took them out of the incubator for their feedings. And Brenda's partner, now her husband, Russ, went out to capture fresh fruit flies every single day. We would mix up the formula. We would change the Kleenexes lining the utility box in which we kept them in their soft little nest. At one point, I woke up in the morning, they were in the same room where I was sleeping, and discovered one had fallen out, was probably kicked out of the nest. I was horrified. I mean, at so many points, I was afraid these guys would die. At one point, they did nearly die of mites. And then we were afraid we might kill them with the insecticide we used to kill the mites. So it was at that point that we realized just how much we love them. And we did something that we are often told rehabilitators are discouraged from doing, and that's naming them. But we did so. We named the larger bird Maya because the Mayans believed that hummingbirds were made from scraps left over from other birds, and their brilliant colors were a parting gift from the sun god. And the smaller one on the bottom here, we named Zuni. Like the Hopi and the Pima, the Zuni believed that hummingbirds bring rain. And that summer in the Bay Area where they lived in California, we needed rain badly. So I'm going to just share one last final portion from the book. And this is about in the middle. Our day is ruled by 1.5-inch long birds. During the daylight hours, there's no possibility of working on a sculpture. There's no chance of visiting a friend's house. There's no chance for a workout at the gym. Brenda can't paint or glaze her clay or ceramic sculptures or work with pastels for the weeks before the babies are weaned. She saves stacks of wildlife magazines to read, and she sketches ideas for new sculptures. In 20-minute snippets, she works on Saving the World, which is the children's art cooperative that she founded. It's called Save the World, one drawing at a time, and it elicits drawings of wildlife from children, which are sold on her website, saveworlddraw.org, to benefit conservation projects the children choose. Every 20 minutes, a baby hummingbird is hungry. What could be more important than that? Russ, too, submits to the tyranny of the nestlings. He dashes to the store for the supersized Kleenex that line the hummingbird's basket. He trolls the compost piles for fruit flies. He picks up takeout for dinner. Everywhere, his lanky 6-foot figure is followed by 4 rescue dogs. Just months from his 60th birthday, the Army Reserve had called him to serve, and within the first 2 months of his year-long residency in Kansas, he sent home 6 homeless dogs he rescued from death row and adopted several of them who live with us now. Russ is retired. Brenda is learning GPS mapping to support the couple's income. But for both of them, it's clear that their real work in the world involves far more than making a living. Fostering baby hummingbirds grew out of a volunteer stint that Brenda had completed in Belize after a hurricane had destroyed an Audubon Environmental Center. She designed and built a new one. When she came home, she visited Wild Care, an animal rehab place where she'd volunteered before, and ran into a rehabilitator who asked her to help with the baby hummingbirds. This was just after 9/11 had turned the mood of so many Americans bitter and helpless. She began saving the lives of the tiny creatures that Spaniards called resurrection birds. The early Spanish visitors to the New World believed that hummingbirds died nightly and revived again. Surely they must have thought something that glittered so brightly was made new each day. This is the gift these baby hummingbirds offer us: a hand in resurrection. Our lives do not stop for them. They begin again. Every 20 minutes, the birds' appetites call us from our busy to-do lists and fast-paced schedules back to life. This is the gift that the hummingbirds gave to us, and in this book, it's the gift I want to pass on to you. Thank you so much.
That was lovely. I'm so I have so many questions now. Before we jump into this, what was the conservation art website that you just mentioned? Someone in the audience is curious.
It's saveworlddraw.org.
saveworlddraw.org. All right, so we'll find that and we'll throw that into the chat bar here. But you heard it here. I have questions. My first is going to jump back to hummingbird mating courtship displays. Can you talk, these tiny flying jewel boxes have, I need to hear more about what they do. These, I mean, you mentioned one diving.
Yes.
So drive fast is a courtship ritual?
Yeah, honest to God, you wouldn't believe what birds will do to get the attention of other birds. It's amazing. And it shows female power, really, because we females are the beneficiaries of these dramatic displays. Now, there's a number of birds that actually will dive to get someone's attention. But this guy, he screams down. The dive lasts about a second. but she can see it. Birds can actually see faster, like they can see more frames per second than we can. So a hummingbird, when you're doing a courtship ritual, she's getting more out of it than you and I even would get out of it. And each species has their own way of attracting a female. Birds are amazing like this. And since birds really are the dinosaurs that survived, it makes you wonder, like, well, what did Stegosaurus do? What did T-Rex do? Yeah, right. Or more like T-Rex, his little hands were like this. So
I imagine that the T-Rex dance is a Thriller. Um, so that's glorious. Now, are female traditionally, I'm sure that nature cares for tradition, but are female hummingbirds as brightly colored as the males?
no, they are not. And there's a good reason for that, because they have to sit on the nest and they don't want to have flashy colors and attract predators. So they, first of all, when they build their nest, they're very careful to camouflage it. And they'll often go pick little bits of lichens off of trees to put on the outside of the nest to camouflage it. Oh, I should mention, since we're talking about nesting, one of the materials that all hummingbirds that I know of use to build their nest is spider silk. And why? Because it's stretchy and it will grow as the babies grow. It will expand as the babies get bigger. Isn't that brilliant?
That's amazing.
But it's so dangerous for the hummingbird to collect this, because you have to fly into a spider web and you can get stuck there.
So they've made an elastic nest from their predator's home. Wow. Okay, so they're brave little jewel boxes. That's horrifying and glorious. I don't know how to follow up with that. So I'm just going to start asking some audience questions here. How many species of plants do the Allen hummingbirds feed on?
Oh boy.
Many.
Very many. I mean, they may visit thousands, literally thousands of individual flowers in one day. It's an enormous number of stuff. They like, certain plants have evolved to be pollinated by hummingbirds. And most hummingbirds love red. So if you are planting a pollinator garden of any kind and you want to attract hummingbirds, put a lot of red in there. They love red so much that hummingbirds have been known to try to pollinate women's lipstick red lips. They'll fly right up to you. They'll try to pollinate your red car. There you go. Oh, I think I see one now.
There you go. Do female hummingbirds make the nests, or do the males help?
The males are of no help. They just spend their time looking gorgeous,
Yeah, they're there to be looked at and admired. So how did you and Brenda meet?
I'm trying to remember, because I was looking for somebody who was a hummingbird rehabilitator. And so I put out my tentacles. This was actually before Soul of an Octopus, so I guess I didn't have as many tentacles then. And she had gone to school here in New England, and she had connections here in New England. And so I was introduced to her by a friend of a friend, and she actually came here to our home in Hancock for the first time I met her. And it was one of those things, sometimes you meet someone and instantly you just love them. Her energy was so great, and her patience was so evident, and her merriment was just like a bubbling fountain of joy being around her. She's a great person.
So how long do hummingbirds live? Do the males or females live longer? And at what time of year do hummingbirds mate and nest and fledge?
Well, there's actually a pretty great map that you can download showing hummingbirds coming toward you. And for those of us here on the East Coast, we have only one species. We have the ruby throat. And my sources tell me that the first one showed up yesterday in our region. So let's see, there were several parts of that question. The males usually arrive first on the migration, and then the females. In the wild, hummingbirds often don't live very long because look at what they have to contend with. But a lucky hummingbird could live 10 years. And there have been hummingbirds who have lived more than 10 years.
I mean, it's so dainty that you wouldn't think. I mean, it seems like a match. You'd light it and it's so frantic, it would burn itself up.
Yeah, you would really think they almost would spontaneously combust.
So what is the relationship between hummingbirds and people? Someone says, especially since setting up hummingbird feeders and watching them is such a joy to so many. The hummingbirds who come to my feeder show little fear and seem very tolerant to coexist with people. Is this the case? Or, I mean, maybe we're just slow moving giants and they're like, I can get out of here fast.
Well, hummingbirds know, they know you. I mean, I bet they know, I'm sure they know individual people. I know they know individual people because the hummingbirds that we raised, when we let them go, they came back to us and asked us for help. So they recognize individual human faces, and they're fearless. My falconry instructor, Nancy Cowan, has seen a hummingbird chase away a hawk. Yeah, they're fearless. And all over South America, there's tales about how they used to be fearless warriors. And now they've been reincarnated because they literally can fight all day long. They will come to your window if you haven't put your feeder out, and they'll hover there looking for you like, garçon, garçon, over here, you know. They totally expect you to serve them.
Excuse me, some service.
I should say too, since you brought that up, that there's a couple of things I should mention about feeding hummingbirds, because it's good to provide nectar for them, but there's ways you can mess it up, and a lot of places will sell you a kit that has red dye in the food, and that is very dangerous. If it gets on their feathers, it will eat away their feathers. So instead of feeding them, you'll be poisoning them, essentially. Don't do that. The other thing is, some people think like, oh, you know what, I'm going to set up a super feeder and I'm going to make mine higher in sugar content, and then I'll get all the birds at my feeder and my neighbors won't have any. Well, do not do that, because that's like giving your kids nothing but Twinkies and then they won't go out and eat bugs. These guys need bugs. They need hundreds of bugs every single day. And so that's the other thing. If you love hummingbirds, do not spray herbicides or pesticides in your yard, because it will kill the protein that they need. One, they won't have anything to eat, or two, if they eat like a dying bug, it'll be a poisoned bug. So do put out feeders for them. Don't put red dye in it. Do plant beautiful flowers for them, red flowers in particular, tubular flowers that they love to stick that bill into. But don't protect your plants that are attracting your hummingbirds with toxic chemicals that will kill your hummingbirds.
So some follow-up questions to that. As opposed to getting red dyed juice, do you then get a red feeder and put in clear juice?
Yes, all you put in is sugar water.
Sugar.
And it's, I think, 1 to 4, 1 scoop of sugar for 4 water, but double check that. That's in the book somewhere. Any red color will, in fact, word will get around. Every hummingbird in town will know that you put out your feeder. It doesn't necessarily have to have red, but red is very attractive to them.
And I know that gardening is not what your focus is. Your focus is animals, but is bee balm a good plant? You said tubular flowers. Do you have any suggestions?
Boy, anything anything red. I mean, a lot of the flowers that Brenda uses out west are actually listed in the book, and they don't all have to be red. I plant just regular old, what do they call it, petunias, in our window boxes, and we get hummingbirds all the time. That's really tubular too. So just think tubular, man.
Do they eat ticks?
No, that's too big for them. They
No.
tend to, I'm trying to think if even the most giant of hummingbirds is like 6 or 8 inches long. It's called the Andean giant. You know, it's still smaller than a robin. They don't eat ticks, but they love little Drosophila melanogaster. You know, the little fruit flies. They love those guys, and that's mostly what we fed them. And these are things you'll find lots of those around your compost pile. So if you have a compost pile, yay for you. They will love that.
Okay, so we have time for just a few more questions. I have a great one here. How can hummingbirds fly such long distances? You mentioned they migrate. How do they fly such long distances without spending most of the day drinking nectar and eating?
Well, they don't fly straight. You know, some birds are able to do their migration stopping very little, but these guys do stop and they do feed. And that's why it's so important that we keep, you know, strips of roadside plants around for migrating birds and for hummingbirds. They need to drink on that corridor, or they'll just run out of energy. And when they run out of energy, you might even find a hummingbird who dropped essentially of exhaustion and starvation. It'll still be alive and you can pick it up, but it just can't move. It doesn't have enough calories to move.
That's that's so sad.
Yeah, but you just take him to your feeder and stick his little beak in there, and he'll revive. He'll revive in your hand. Sometimes also they get cold early in the morning. It's called torpor. And if you find a dead hummingbird on the ground, pick the bird up, let it warm up in your hand, and sometimes it will come back to life in your hand.
Well, that feeds into this next question of what climate range can hummingbirds live in? Do they like to be hot? They apparently do not like to be cool.
Right. If it gets too cold, they can't move. However, recently, since I worked with Brenda, there was discovered in South America a highland species of hummingbird that appears to essentially hibernate, a hibernating bird. Birds aren't known to hibernate, but
No.
this one does, which is pretty amazing. But most of the time, you know, they interestingly, they only live in North and South America. They are not found in Europe. They are not found in Asia. They are not found in Australia. They are not found in Africa. Only we have them. And when you get visitors from overseas, they can't believe this thing. It really seems magic.
It doesn't seem real. It really doesn't. As you mentioned, they can hover, truly hover. They can go back and forth. I mean, I believe they look like fairies.
They
I can
really do.
absolutely believe that folklore around fairies would have popped up around them if they had been European. So hummingbirds, they appear, I guess last question, they appear so frantic. Do they experience time differently than we do? I'm sure this isn't really a question that we could really get into. We don't have computers hook up to hummingbird brains, but they're so quick. How do they experience the world when we move so like molasses to them?
You know, time is something that I'm examining in a new book I'm working on now, which focuses on turtles. But it is believed that animals, different species of animals, do experience time differently than we do. They may perceive time differently than we do. A dog, for example, keeps track of time probably by decaying odors. And so this is how your dog knows You know, oh, it's been 8 hours since I saw my person because the smell is decaying. Other animals can perceive time by the rate at which their stomach is emptying, for example. Um, Many animals, because of the difference in their eyes, the way that their eyes are different from ours, rather, see time differently. Birds, for example, their eyes see colors we don't experience, and they see frames faster than we do. We would see a blur and they might see individual frames. So that is a really interesting question that deserves a much more detailed answer than I could even give you now if we had a whole hour ahead of us. But it's a great thing to contemplate, and it's something I am contemplating right now.
Well, to wrap up our event, tell us what you're working on.
I am working on 2 books on turtles with a wonderful artist named Matt Patterson. And as part of our research, we're spending at least 1 day a week and some days more. We at a turtle hospital at Turtle Rescue League, which is run by 2 ladies in Southbridge, Massachusetts. In their basement, they have 200 turtles of many different species, many of whom have had collisions with cars, or they've some of them were hatched there from eggs that were laid in a place that you couldn't safely hatch there, and they were hatched out in their incubators. People who don't want their tortoise anymore, they drop their turtle off. Their turtle might have some disease. And this time of year, we're getting in lots and lots of patients, because right after the hummingbirds show up, the next thing you're going to see, at least on the East Coast, is you're going to see turtles looking for nests. So when they do that, they're crossing roads and they're getting hit by cars. When they're hit by cars, though, they can be put back together, and they can be put back together and really brought back to life in incredible ways. You would not believe some of these patients. One turtle I know was dead with no heartbeat, and we're probably going to be letting her go this year. Her name is Snowball. She's a big old snapping turtle. So again, I get to have a small hand in resurrection.
That sounds wonderful, and we look forward to that. And maybe by that time, we'll be able to have you in person in the store. I look forward to that. Thank you so much for joining us. Signed copies of The Hummingbirds Gift, Wonder, Beauty, and Renewal on Wings by Cy Montgomery are available from Gibson's Bookstore. We are happy to ship your copy to you, or you may walk in or get curbside pickup to purchase your copy. Thank you so much, everybody joining me from home. Thank you so much, Cy.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. You were terrific. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.
Have a great night, everybody. Keep an eye out for hummingbirds.